On May 18, 1980, Ian, the singer of an obscure independent British rock band, committed suicide, and outside of a group of family, friends, and fans, the world barely noticed. And it's understandable. The group had just one album and a handful of other songs to their name. Heck, they barely toured outside of England, and their music was not exactly what you'd call listener-friendly. No one really knows why Ian took his own life. It's true that he wasn't well and that he had substance abuse issues as well as marital problems, but really no one can say that they saw it coming. So that's it. Your singer and lyricist checks out, and it's over. The band is done. Mourn, pick up the pieces, and move on. And that's exactly what happened. For a few years anyway. But then something strange happened. Over the next decade, more and more people discovered Ian and the music his band had left behind. Today, a quarter of a century later, Ian's group is considered to be one of the founding fathers of not only several genres of new rock, but of all alternative rock, period. How the hell did that happen? Here is the legendary story of Ian Curtis and Joy Division.
Now, the ongoing history of new music.
Ian Curtis, lead singer of Joy Division, has died today.
Ian Curtis and Joy Division with Shadow Play from Unknown Pleasures, a landmark record released during the second week in June of 1979. This record would change everything, eventually. We now view Joy Division as one of the most important bands in the history of new rock. Their DNA can be found in bands ranging from Interpol to Nine Inch Nails. But if you rewind to the late 1970s and those first few months of 1980, you'll find a group so poor that the singer had to give away his dog because he literally couldn't afford to feed him anymore. So let that be a warning to you. This is not going to be a feel-good story. In fact, this is one of the saddest things you will ever hear as a music fan. Still with me? Okay, then. Over the last quarter century, Ian Curtis has become one of those tragic, mythical figures like Kurt Cobain and Sid Vicious and Jim Morrison. His poetry and the music of Joy Division has been discovered and rediscovered by several generations of music fans. So who was this guy? Well, Ian was born in Manchester, England, July 15th, 1956. His father was a police detective, and he had a younger sister named Carol. The family was brought up in Huddersfield, which is just outside of Manchester proper. Like his father, Ian loved to read. And not just anything either. Ian was into Dostoevsky and Sartre. He also had an interesting fascination with military history, including Nazi Germany. Oddly enough, though, Ian hated school. He would stay home with his books and his records by Iggy Pop and David Bowie and Lou Reed rather than go to class. Part of the problem was that when he did go to school, he and his classmates were obligated to spend time at the local retirement homes, to keep the residents company. Although that wasn't too bad after Ian and his friends started rifling through the old folks' medicine cabinets, helping themselves to whatever medication they could find. There was one particularly scary incident where Ian ended up having his stomach pumped. Then there was the time he was expelled for coming to class high on cough medicine. He was also a fan of solvents, Valium, and various barbiturates. On August 23, 1974, he married his girlfriend, Deborah, whom he had met when he was 16. She thought he was mysterious and cool, and the fact that he kept a box full of poetry that he had written was interesting too. But then again, some of that poetry contained romantic fantasies involving Ian dying young. Even though they were just 19, they managed to buy themselves a house, and one room turned into a place where Ian could write his music. Meanwhile, Ian got a day job in a record store, which is where he discovered punk rock. That interest really took off when he was one of the few dozen people in the audience when the Sex Pistols played the Manchester Free Trade Hall on June 4, 1976. Together with Peter Hook and Bernard Albrecht, two guys he kept bumping into again and again at concerts, including that Pistols gig, they decided to form a band. And at first they were called the Stiff Kittens, but Ian hated that name because he felt it made them sound like any other punk band. Everyone soon settled on Warsaw. That sounded different. And besides, it was inspired by a song called Warsaw on David Bowie's Low album. Bowie was one of Ian's heroes, so that was cool. Warsaw played their first gig on May 29, 1977, at a Manchester club called the Electric Circus. Reviews were a little mixed, but they did get a nice couple of lines in the music papers. "There's an elusive spark of dissimilarity," this reviewer wrote. "I like them, and will like them even more in 6 months' time." Warsaw were good enough to get a few more gigs, which resulted in a few more good reviews, which resulted in more gigs. They even placed a song on a long-forgotten 10-inch record entitled Short Circuit, live at the Electric Circus. Their contribution was a song called At a Later Date. By July 1977, despite the fact that they couldn't seem to find a permanent drummer, Warsaw was ready to record a demo tape. And this is what it sounded like. This is a studio version of the song that ended up on the Electric Circus album. This is Warsaw with At a Later Date.
Because it's plain blue. Some things in life are free, cover everything that's true. Only one thing wrong with that one, it's the bad I don't use. Drinking rough beer. The world's a very shady place and you got just a soul. Cranberry seem to think when interest gets a hold. At a later date, it might come as a surprise. At a later date, I hope that you're alright.
Joy Division performing as Warsaw from a long, misplaced demo tape recorded on July 18, 1977. The next big date in Joy Division history was in August, when they finally found a permanent drummer. His name was Stephen Morris, and it's a good thing he worked out because he was the only guy who replied to Warsaw's ad for a drummer in the local music magazine. Here he is talking about it in an interview with the BBC.
First time I met him was outside Strangeways prison in the car park. I thought, hang on, well, have they been on holiday or have they actually been inside and they're getting let out? Very strange. So that was when I first actually encountered Bernard and Peter in Strangeways car park. And, yeah, we just went on from there. I just had the ability to go boom bang at fairly regular intervals, which quite appealed to him, I think.
Now that the lineup was complete, it was time to start getting serious about releasing a record. Ian told his bank manager that he needed £400 to buy some dining room furniture. But when the money came through, it went straight towards the recording and pressing of 1,200 copies of the first Joy Division record. It was ready by July 1978, and so was the band's new name. Warsaw had always been getting confused with a London metal band called Warsaw Pact, and rather than get into some kind of fight, they just would change their name. But what were they going to do? Now, you remember what I said about Ian having a fascination with Nazi Germany? He had read a book published in 1971 called House of Dolls by Karol Satinsky. This book is all about life inside a concentration camp during World War II. And if you skip through the text, you'll find this passage. At the last table, where the camp doctor and the master calefactress were waiting, the fate of each girl was sealed. There the die was cast as to which of the sections the camp she would be sent, Labor Division or Joy Division. The Joy Division was where women were forced to do sexual favors for Nazi officers on leave. I mean, how dark was that? So after one last gig as Warsaw on New Year's Eve 1977, Ian Curtis, Barney Albrecht, Peter Hook, and Stephen Morris officially became Joy Division. From the 4-track 7-inch EP entitled An Ideal for Living, here they are with a song called, strangely enough, Warsaw.
3501250 go! I was there in the backstage when this light came around. I grew up not a changeling, but when the first time around, I could see all the weakness, I could pick all the faults, but I could see all the fake tests, just a stick in your throat. B1G, B1G, B1G. Hung around in your soundtrack to mirror all that you've done, to find the right side of reason, to kill the feelings for one. I can see all the cold facts, I can see through your eyes. All this told me no contact, no matter how hard you try. 3-1-G, 3-1-G, 3-1-G.
Once the Ideal for Living EP was out, Joy Division was ready to start another project. They tried to record an album for RCA Records in 1978, but that didn't happen, and the whole thing was scrapped before anything significant was accomplished. Then came a strange break. April 14th, 1978. Joy Division enters a local Battle of the Bands competition at a local place called Rafters in hopes of landing a record deal. Amongst all the producers and label reps attending that night, there would be this guy named Tony Wilson. Now, Tony hosted a TV show called So It Goes, sort of an alternative version of the weekly Top of the Pops show. Ian believed that Tony needed to know about Joy Division, but instead of being all polite and respectful, Ian just slammed the guy, complete with a very angry, very insulting letter. Now, you would think that Tony would blow off this Manchester punk as some sort of drunken yob, right? Well, no, Tony was quite impressed by Ian's cheekiness because he immediately agreed to book Joy Division on his TV show. When they made it to TV, their performance impressed another guy, Rob Gretton, the person who would become Joy Division's manager. And then another weird thing. Soon after that original Battle of the Band show, one of Tony Wilson's relatives died, leaving him a modest inheritance. And what did he do with that money? He started a record company called Factory. And in January 1978, he issued a record featuring material by some of the new bands on his new label. One of them was Joy Division. And here's one of their songs from the Factory Sampler album. It's called Digital.
closing in, feel it closing in. Day in, day out, 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 day in, day out. Oh.
Joy Division from a compilation known as A Factory Sampler, released in January 1979. At this point, Factory Records was just a dumpy little independent record company. But because Tony Wilson was a TV personality and a born self-promoter, some of the right people paid attention. Joy Division got more and more gigs and were getting prepped to record their first full album. Things were looking up, except for one thing. Ian was not a well man. In fact, things had already begun to change, with something that happened just after midnight on December 27th, 1978. That story's next.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. This is the ongoing history of new music.
Ian Curtis of Joy Division wasn't really what you'd call a sickly kid, but he did have his health challenges. For example, he was allergic to sunlight. If he stayed outside for too long, his hands would swell up like big red balloons. And once they did, he'd have to have them bandaged up for a couple of days. He was afraid of foam rubber, which was a little strange. He was also prone to Jekyll and Hyde mood swings. At the party celebrating his engagement to Deborah, he threw a drink at her when he thought she was flirting with his uncle. When he was in the band, the other guys would often be faced with the alter Ian, times when he'd do some seriously strange stuff, like kicking in a door or getting in a fight. And then there was something else. When he was a teenager, Ian and some friends went to a gig in Manchester featuring a band that used a strobe light on stage. After watching it for a while, Ian collapsed on the floor. The security guards thought he was just another dumb kid on drugs and roughly escorted him out of the building. In 1977, Ian got a civil service job with the Manpower Services Commission. Part of his job was to make sure that people got the health benefits they were due. And this is when he learned something about epilepsy. After some on-the-job training, Ian became something of an expert on the subject. Then came December 27, 1978. The members of Joy Division were in their van on their way home from their first ever gig in London at a place called the Hope and Anchor. It was cold, the flu was making its way through the band, and the show had gone badly. All that work and travel for a payoff of 60 pounds. About halfway back to Manchester, Ian started grabbing at Barney's sleeping bag, and then he started lashing out, punching at the windows of the van. Stephen pulled over, and they managed to help Ian ride out this seizure. Ian's first confirmed epileptic seizure. He was taken to the hospital and released. When Ian went to see his doctor, he just kind of shrugged and put Ian on a waiting list to see a specialist. But the seizures continued, and they came more frequently, sometimes up to 4 a week, and they were often very violent and very scary. Ian finally got to see a specialist a few weeks later. He was prescribed a series of anticonvulsive drugs, and when one prescription didn't work, he would just try another, and another, and another after that. While some of the drugs worked, they never really eliminated the attacks. In fact, they made his mood swings even more severe, and people around him began to wonder what was making him more unhappy, the epilepsy or the anti-epilepsy drugs. And then there was the matter of Ian's dancing. Now wait, hear me out. When Joy Division played live, Ian would dance in this very herky-jerky kind of way. It was almost as if he were being electrocuted or something. Was he dancing, or was he suffering another seizure? It became very hard to tell. And finally, people began to notice that Ian's lyrics and poetry were becoming darker and more depressing. Ian used to carry a plastic bag full of notebooks with him everywhere, and whenever the mood struck him, he'd just sit down and write. And as these lyrics were mated to music, Joy Division's sound turned more somber and dark and depressing, and just about everything was written in some kind of minor key.
just says it all. She's lost control. And she's clinging to the nearest passerby. She's lost control. And she gave away the secrets of her past and said, I've lost control again. And of a voice that told her when and where to act, she said, I've lost control again. And she turned around and took me by the hand and said, I've lost control again. And how I'll never know just why or understand, she said, I've lost control again. And she screamed out, kicking on her side, and said, I've lost control again. And seized upon the floor, I thought she died, she said, I've lost control. She's lost control again. She's lost control. She's lost control again. She's lost control.
Joy Division and She's Lost Control, a song Ian Curtis wrote when he saw a woman fall victim to an epileptic fit, not unlike his own. By early 1979, the original punk rock scene had pretty much burned itself out, and we entered the era of post-punk, a time when it seemed like a new sound and attitude came out every day. Joy Division was perfectly positioned to take advantage of this. They found that there was an audience for their brand of dark, moody, depressing stuff. When Ian appeared on the cover of the NME in January 1979 wearing a dark raincoat, diehard fans started attending gigs dressed the same way. Then the BBC came calling. 4 songs were recorded for the John Peel Show on BBC Radio 1. The session took place on the 31st of January, and the tapes were broadcast on Valentine's Day. From those tapes, this is Transmission. After that appearance on the BBC, the next thing to do was make a full and proper album. So, in April 1979, Joy Division booked some time in Strawberry Studios with producer Martin Hannett. Now, Martin was a wacko. A genius, but a certifiable wacko. Not only did he clean up the band's sound, but he's the guy who found that distinctive drum sound. He'd do radical things like completely rebuild the kit and then reassemble it on the roof of the studio and record Stephen Morris playing it up there. He added echo and sound effects, And in order to get the right performance, he'd have the band standing together in the studio with the lights turned down very, very low. It was all very lo-fi, very atmospheric, and very urgent sounding. It was very, very different from everything else that was happening in 1979. Tony Wilson, the head of Factory, was so thrilled with the results that he put up £8,500, all the money Factory had, to press up 10,000 copies of this record. And when the album came out, all the reviews said two things. It was the most radical post-punk record of the year, and that it was a masterpiece. The name of the record was Unknown Pleasures.
I've been waiting for a guy to come and take me by the hand. 'Cause these sensations make me feel the pleasures of a normal man. These sensations spare the insults, leave them for another day. I've got the spirit, lose the feeling, take the shock away. It's getting faster, moving faster now, it's getting out of hand. On the 10th floor, down the back stairs, into no man's land. Lights are flashing, cars are crashing, getting frequent now. I've got the spirit, lose the feeling, let it out somehow.
Joy Division and Disorder from Unknown Pleasures, one of the most important post-punk alternative records of all time. One of the most striking features of the album was the cover. It was black with almost no text anywhere. The front featured a strange picture that looked like a drawing of a mountain range or something. Actually, that image was found in an astronomy book. It's a graphical representation of 100 consecutive pulses from pulsar number CP1919 at the center of the Dumbbell Nebula in the constellation of Vulpecula. Unknown Pleasures captured the mood of Manchester that summer. It was very hot, the economy had gone very bad, many people were out of work, and the city's very ancient sewer system had begun to crumble. So in addition to the heat and the humidity and the smog, there was always that smell in the air. The album was an immediate success, and the first pressing of 10,000 copies sold out almost immediately. But there was something else requiring Ian's attention, a new daughter named Natalie. Now, Ian loved Natalie, but he was afraid to pick her up or even touch her for fear he would have a seizure and hurt her. And you really couldn't blame him. As Joy Division's popularity increased, the more gigs they played, and the harder they worked, the worse and more frequent the attacks became. For example, after a particularly tough stretch of gigs in May 1979, Ian suffered 4 grand mal seizures in one night. Plus, his moods were becoming more and more erratic. He and Deborah went to the doctor again, but he wasn't much help at all. They felt, in fact, that there was something wrong with the doctor. And that was actually a really good guess, because this doctor, who was supposed to be treating Ian for epilepsy and depression, shot himself several weeks later. October 16th, 1979 was another important date in Joy Division history. It has nothing to do with the band, the music, or Ian's health. But it was an event that changed everything for Joy Division, for Ian, and his family. That story's next.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. This is the ongoing history of new music.
By October 1979, things were not going well between Ian and Deborah. He was moody and unpredictable, and his epileptic seizures were coming more frequently. But at the same time, no one really knew when it was a real seizure or if it was just one of those times when Ian faked it just so he could manipulate people. He was also mixing his prescriptions with a lot of drugs and alcohol. Plus, it had become an unwritten rule amongst the members of Joy Division that wives and girlfriends were no longer welcome at gigs. On October 16th, the band played a gig at a place called Plan K in Brussels, Belgium, where Ian met a woman named Annick Honoré, who looked like Susie Sue of Susie and the Banshees, if that helps. This encounter led to a full-blown affair. Once he got back to Manchester, he'd often tell Deborah that he was going to a soccer match or maybe down to the pub for a pint, when in fact he was slipping out to meet Annick, who, by the way, had now moved to London and was working at the Belgian embassy. When the group left on a European tour on January 10, 1980, Annick toured with them. And when Ian was in London, he'd stay with Annick. Deborah knew all about the affair, so you can imagine what home life was like. Added the money problems. It was so tight that they could no longer afford to keep their dog. You can probably imagine how awful things were. But as bad as it was for Ian at home, things were going very well for Joy Division. Between March 18th and 30th, 1980, they started recording a new album that would eventually be called Closer. Thanks to coaching from producer Martin Hannett and Tony Wilson, Ian's voice had become deeper and richer. They had told him to listen to a lot of Frank Sinatra records. Sing like Frank, they said. Meanwhile, there was a new single in the stores. It was called Atmosphere. Once the Closer album was finished, Joy Division embarked on a series of grueling gigs. During the first week of April 1980, the band was sometimes playing 2 gigs a day, and Ian was not well. The pressures of the album, the current tour, an impending North American tour, his failing marriage, his demanding mistress, the alcohol, the drugs, the late nights, his epilepsy, it was a bit much. They got to the point where he couldn't fall asleep until he had a seizure. He was taking a drug called carbamazepine, along with phenobarbital, but they were making his mood swings even more unpredictable. On April 4th, 1980, during a show with the Stranglers at a London venue called The Rainbow, Ian suffered 3 attacks during the first 5 songs of the set before collapsing entirely. The band would have stopped the set sooner, but it had become impossible to tell whether Ian was having a seizure or just dancing in his trademark herky-jerky way. 3 days later, Ian purposely overdosed on his epilepsy medication. He was taken to the hospital in time where he had his stomach pumped. And although this was clearly a suicide attempt, he left a note and everything, the psychiatrist who examined Ian that night at the hospital declared that he was not suicidal. "Go home," he said. In hindsight, this would have been a good time for a break, but no. Concerts had been booked and the band had to play. So after staying overnight in the hospital, Ian was taken directly to the next gig at a place called Derby Hall. The date was April the 8th, but Ian was so shaky that he was only able to sing 2 songs. And then the crowd freaked. 5 people ended up being taken to hospital after some kind of a mini riot. Ian himself got sicker and more depressed. Ian announced that he was leaving the band. He was moving to Holland to open a bookshop. A day later, he acted as if he hadn't said a thing. Deborah wanted a divorce, so Ian moved out and eventually settled in with his parents. And here's something very strange. Joy Division guitarist Bernard Albrecht decided to hypnotize Ian. Apparently, Barney's very good at this stuff. When he put Ian in a trance, he regressed into a previous life, a 17th century French peasant who lived in a hut and who was on his deathbed. The final Joy Division gig was held on May 2nd, 1980 at Birmingham University. The show was recorded, and here's what it sounded like that night.
Weary inside, now our hearts lost forever. Can't replace the fear or the thrill of the chase. These rituals showed up the door for our wanderings. Open and shut and slammed in our face.
You hear that? You hear the crowd cheering? They're doing that because Ian has just fainted. They thought it was all part of the act. Truth is, Ian is having another seizure. It's okay, he's going to go off and then come back for an encore. That was it for gigs for a little while, because on Monday, May 19th, Joy Division was scheduled to leave on a North American tour. There was every indication that this was the tour that was going to make them famous. The good news is that over the next 2 weeks, Ian didn't have any seizures. He actually seemed to be in a pretty good mood. But at home, things were still kind of ugly. There was the impending divorce from Deborah, and Anik was demanding more from him, and it just wasn't good. Here's bass player Peter Hook speaking to the BBC.
On Closer, or the year before Closer, was when Ian's trouble began. That was when he got ill. So that's how sort of put the mockers on it a bit. You know, because I mean, it's like we were getting to the point where we could work a lot, and everyone enjoyed working a lot. Then we never bothered about it, but we couldn't because, you know, Ian's physical limitations, and there was nobody that was more upset about it than him. You see, that's what got him down a lot.
On Thursday, May 15th, Ian hung out with Peter Hook, playing pool in a local pub. The next day, Peter dropped Ian off at his parents' house with instructions to start packing because they were going to be on a plane to America the next week. On Saturday, the 17th, Ian was supposed to go over to Barney's place so they could go water skiing. But Ian bailed, saying that he really wanted to rest up. And besides, there was this really cool movie on TV Saturday night that he really wanted to see. That evening, Ian went back to his house at 77 Barton Street in Macclesfield. Deborah was out working as a bartender at a wedding reception. She knew that he was at the house. In fact, they had spoken. Ian said he needed some time alone and made Deborah agree that she wouldn't come home until after 10 the next morning. Totally exasperated and not wanting to fight anymore, she said fine and spent the night at her parents' house. Once she was gone, Ian sat down to watch his movie. It was a 1977 film entitled Strozek. How's this for freaky? It's all about a musician and a former mental patient who travels to America and is unable to decide between the two women in his life. During the movie, Ian drank several cups of very strong coffee and chased it down with a shot of whiskey. Then, with pictures of his wife and baby daughter sitting on the table in front of him, Ian began to write a very long note to Deborah. He wrote all night. When he had finished, the sun was starting to come up. It was the morning of Sunday, May 18th. After he was done writing, Ian went over to the stereo and put on his favorite album. It was The Idiot by Iggy Pop. He went out to the garden and got a length of rope from the clothesline. And as the sun came up and Iggy Pop sang, Ian hanged himself. It was Deborah who found him a few hours later. Here's Barney speaking to the BBC.
I just had a real good day. I was been water skiing in friends in Pontley File near Blackpool. It was a really nice sunny day, and I just got back to this house, this friend, and the phone rang and it was Rob, and he just said, "Oh, Ian's committed suicide." And I said, "What, he's tried to commit suicide?" "No, he's done it, he's dead." And the room just spun round, you know.
This is Peter Hook.
The fact that he couldn't do, I mean, he most wanted success. He really, really did want to be successful in a band so that he could prove to all the people, all the sort of people who thought you couldn't do it or, you know, had scoffed at you or whatever. And he never got the chance, which is the saddest thing of all, really. That was what he most wanted. And we only got that freedom after Closer with Love Will Tear Us Apart. That was when we really got the freedom to be like, maybe, you know, not a successful band, but like a serious band where you could actually do what you wanted to do, actual full-time, and not really worry about where your next, you know, £2 was coming from or whatever. And he never really got that. He just missed out on it by a week.
An inquest was held into Ian's death. The official verdict was asphyxia with ligature around the neck. Age, 23 years. Ian's body was cremated on May 23rd, and it was Deborah who selected the inscription for Ian's headstone laid in Macclesfield Cemetery. It reads, Ian Curtis, 18580. Love will tear us apart. Love Will Tear Us Apart, the Joy Division single released about 3 weeks after Ian's death. Ian had written the song sometime late in the summer of 1979, and there are actually several recorded versions of the song out there because the band couldn't decide on which one they liked best. There was an odd suicide pact amongst members of Joy Division. The deal was that should any member leave for any reason, Joy Division would be broken up. So, once Ian was gone, Peter Hook Bernard Albrecht and Stephen Morris kept their word. Joy Division was retired, and work was started on the next project, eventually known as New Order. Several years later, they would write a song entitled Blue Monday, which is a song all about Monday, May 19th, 1980, the day after Ian died. Since that day, Joy Division has become a legend. Their albums still sell like crazy. More than 100 bootlegs still circulate. And one of the best rock biographies you'll ever read is a 1995 book written by Deborah Curtis entitled Touching from a Distance. The title is taken from a line in the song Transmission. It's tough to underestimate Joy Division's musical influence. Their sound and style contributed to everything from the development of goth and industrial music to emo. And of course, there's the work of New Order, which also helped transform alternative music in the 80s and into the 90s. Joy Division was this amazing band with all kinds of potential. Ian Curtis was their heart and soul. It's just so tragic that he was in so much pain. Back in a moment.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. This is the ongoing history of new music.
There are still many unanswered questions about the death of Ian Curtis. Why did he do it when he did it? Was it an accident brought on by a mix of drugs? We'll never know. While the rest of Joy Division reinvented themselves as New Order, Deborah Curtis has moved on too. She lives in northern England with a new partner. Natalie, Ian's daughter, is now a photographer living in Manchester. Big Manchester City fan, just like Dad was. Meanwhile, the fascination with Joy Division continues. The records continue to sell. There's an excellent box set called Heart and Soul. They were a big part of the movie 24-Hour Party People, which is excellent. There's a proposed feature film about Ian's life called Control, directed by famed U2 photographer Anton Corbijn and executive produced by Tony Wilson. And in 2005, Deborah Curtis has republished Touching from a Distance. Fascinating stuff. If you really want to know where a lot of today's music came from, it is definitely worth knowing more about Joy Division. Technical production for this show is by Rob Johnston and Andrew Leong. I'm Alan Cross.
You've been listening to The Ongoing History of New Music, a Deep Sky production.